situated. Well, it is great to be back with all of you this evening. Always happy to be here with this wonderful congregation with so many people that Michelle and I love. And especially glad to be here on such a beautiful day. It's a little bit cool, but still beautiful. Most of all, it's a beautiful day to worship the Lord. So glad that we are all here together to do that. One of Aesop's fables tells of a turtle. And this turtle was envious. He lived his life in this pond and, had a very normal turtle life. Didn't really go very far, couldn't go very far. And so he just sort of lived there on the edge of the bank or in the water, doing sort of normal turtle things. But there were ducks that lived there in the pond with him. And he was so envious of those ducks because he saw them going distances. He saw them being able to fly and being able to go far from the pond and see other parts of the world, but then able to come back home. And so he was jealous. He wished that he could have what those ducks had. And so there were a couple of ducks that sort of felt sorry for him and decided, we should help him out. And so they said, we'll tell you what, turtle, we will help you. We will help you to be able to see the world the way we see the world. And so we're going to take this stick, and each of us will take the end of the stick and hold it in our mouths, and then you hold the middle of the stick in your mouth, and we will fly around and let you see the world. But they said the one thing that you must do is be quiet. You have to be quiet. Because if you're not, there's going to be a problem. Well, he agreed to that, and he was so excited. And so the ducks each took the end of the stick. The turtle took the middle of the stick in his mouth, and the ducks began to fly. And the turtle was ecstatic. He was flying over the hilltops. He could see the flowers on the fields. He could see up above the pond a whole new perspective of his world. And he was thrilled. He was just so excited about what he was getting to experience. Well, just then a crow flew by. And this crow was just shocked to see a turtle flying. He had never seen a turtle fly before. He didn't know turtles could fly, and he was just amazed to see this turtle up in the air with him and the other birds. And he said, surely this must be the king of all turtles. And the turtle said, well, certainly. But just as he did, as he opened his mouth, he lost grip of the stick and he fell. See, this turtle, who was humble, he was by nature a humble creature, became proud. Because he was able to experience something, he was able to accomplish something that other turtles just couldn't accomplish. And so he became proud in that. He had no reason to be proud. He hadn't done anything. The only reason he could fly was because the ducks allowed him to. Yet because he became proud, it led to his downfall. Literally his downfall. He fell from the sky. Well, isn't that the way it is for us? So many people in the world, so many of us, many times, will become proud for really no reason that we've done. It's not that we've accomplished something great. It's not that we've done or achieved or received because of our efforts. It's because of God. God has provided. We have achieved or received because of God, and yet we become puffed up and proud. And so the Bible warns us about pride. Well, the first question is pride sinful? See, I know someone who has boys that he's raised, and they've grown up and they're successful, and this man will not say that he's proud of his boys. He just refuses to say it. And the reason he won't say he's proud of them is because the Bible says that pride is a sin. See, that's a very sad misunderstanding of the Bible's teachings of pride. There's nothing wrong in saying that you're proud of something. There's nothing wrong in saying that you're proud of someone. In fact, the Bible gives examples of that very thing. My eyes have gotten bad enough I have to use my glasses now, so they'll be coming on and off. But pride itself is not inherently sinful. It depends on what we have pride in and why. See, Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:31 says, I protest, brothers, by my pride in you, which I have in Jesus Christ our Lord, I die every day. In 2 Corinthians 7:4 he says, I am acting with great boldness toward you. I have great pride in you. I am filled with comfort. In all our affliction, I am overflowing with joy. See, Paul had pride in his fellow Christians. The Bible does not teach that pride in and of itself is wrong. Paul shows us here that pride is perfectly appropriate. And it is appropriate. I can look out at this congregation and I can feel pride in what this congregation has built from almost nothing. And look at you today. I have pride in that, but not because of the simple work of the people here in this building. It's the work of these people because of God. It's God working through these people. So Paul had pride in those Christians, but not a puffed up. It was not a, look how good I am because the people I have taught have accomplished so much. The pride Paul felt was in knowing that God had done so much in the lives of these Christians and that they had been able to accomplish God's work. Paul also says in Philippians 2, and turn over there if you would, Philippians 2, verses 14 through 18. Philippians 2, 14 through 18. And it says, do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me. See, Paul said, because of the things that we've accomplished, because of the success that we've had for God, we can be proud. It's not a boastful pride. It's not a pride in ourselves. It's a pride in God working through us. So don't misunderstand the Bible's teaching that pride in and of itself is a sin. It's not. Pride is very commendable according to what we see here with Paul, but it's what you have pride in. And that is where people run into problems. See, if our pride is in ourselves and without acknowledgement of what God has done through us, then our pride becomes sinful. I can be proud of the things I've done at my job. I can be proud of the family that I've raised. I can be proud of the marriage that I have. I can be proud of so many things in life, but if I look at those things and I say, I'm proud of what I did, I have this great marriage because I am such a good husband. I'm proud of my kids because I am such a good dad. I'm proud of what I've accomplished as a Christian because I am such a good Christian. Because I am so moral. That's the wrong kind of pride. Because that pride is pride in myself. The pride I should have is pride in what God has allowed me to accomplish. And as long as I'm acknowledging God in the things I accomplish, I have a much better chance of my pride being in the right place. Proverbs 21 and verse 4 says, "Haughty eyes and a proud heart, the lamp of the wicked is sin." See, haughty eyes and a proud heart, and then he says, the lamp of the wicked. So what is, when we see in the Bible the imagery of a lamp, what is it for? It's to light the way, right? See, we don't think about that as much in terms of lamps now, because for us a lamp, sits on the end table or sits on our nightstand or something like that and lights up the room. But in the Bible, we're talking about using a lamp to light their way, to help them see as they moved from one place to another. See, the lamp here is sinful, because the lamp, what guides the people he's talking about here in Proverbs, is their haughty eyes. It's their pride. It's their desire to accomplish and become and achieve in and of themselves, and that guides what they do. And that's where pride becomes a problem, because that kind of pride guides us farther and farther from God. That is a lamp that is leading us in the wrong direction. Sure, it lights the way, but the way is completely wrong. It's the opposite direction of where we should be going. Then Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, there are 6 things that the Lord hates, 7 that are an abomination to him. And the very first one listed is haughty eyes. So when we see in this passage, what we see here is that although pride in and of itself is not sinful, this kind of pride, the haughtiness, those eyes that guide us toward our own pride, our own accomplishment or desires or drives, that's not only sinful, it says here it's an abomination. God hates that kind of pride. So while it may not in and of itself be sinful, when it becomes this kind of pride, it takes us so far from God that we are into the realm of abomination. That's how bad this kind of sin is, or this kind of pride is. Now look at Daniel chapter 4. Daniel chapter 4. And this is a story that most of us know well. But starting in verse 28, it talks to us about King Nebuchadnezzar. And we know about King Nebuchadnezzar and the king of Babylon and this great and powerful king. And in verse 28 it says, "All this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, 'Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?'" Well, that sounds an awful lot like a turtle opening his mouth, holding onto a stick, flying, doesn't it? You've got this king who certainly has amazing wealth, an amazing kingdom. And he describes it as, "Look at what I have done. Look at this magnificent kingdom that I have built." Well, in God's eyes, that was sinful pride. And we know that God felt that way because in verse 31 it said, "While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven, 'O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. See, what Nebuchadnezzar didn't recognize was the only reason he had this magnificent kingdom is because God allowed him to have it. He says, the king of the Most High rules and gives it to him whom he will. God decides who the riches go to. God decides who the power goes to. God decides who the accomplishment goes to. It is only because of God that Nebuchadnezzar had these things. And he was taken from this mighty king over a mighty kingdom to essentially an animal that grazed in the field with the oxen. Now, the good thing is that Nebuchadnezzar recognized that it had happened because of his pride. Nebuchadnezzar realized his pride had brought him low. And so in verse 37 it says, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." Amen. See, not only is God able to provide, he is able to remove. If your pride takes over, God can take it all away. And what Nebuchadnezzar realized is that's exactly what happened because of his pride. So sin in of itself is not, pride in and of itself is not sinful. But when it becomes this kind of pride, this pride in ourselves without acknowledging God, it is sinful. But then the question is, what are the results of sinful pride? What happens when we develop that kind of pride? Well, the first thing we know is that you're brought low. And the perfect example of that is what we just read. Nebuchadnezzar was brought from what was essentially the highest place in society to the lowest. He was below man. I mean, if you think about that, man, even the lowest man, is above the animals, right? Well, this man, who was above every other man, was brought lower than the lowest man. That's the kind of impact that this sinful pride can have. And we see it in our society. We see people that become so proud in what they've accomplished. We saw it, Michelle and I were just watching the Bernie Madoff documentary this past week. And for those that don't know, Bernie Madoff was the one that engaged in essentially the largest Ponzi scheme in the history of the country. Billions and billions of dollars of fraud. And many, many people lost their entire life savings because of it. Bernie Madoff was essentially Nebuchadnezzar of Wall Street. He was the highest of the high. He had yachts, he had mansions, he had a home in France, he had his own private jet, and he died in prison because he became prideful. He became so proud and focused on what he wanted to accomplish, it was never enough, and he wanted more until finally he was brought low. And we see people that happens to, where they, even to the point of taking their own lives, because they can't handle going from the status that they were in, the pride that they had, to as low as they become, because their life savings is wiped out, or they lose their job, or they lose their family, or whatever it is that they've put their pride in. They lose those things, and they lose themselves. And they're brought so low, and they can't handle that. Now, I would never say that God took those things away from them, or that God caused them to take their lives. Certainly I wouldn't say that. But God will allow things to happen, and pride inevitably will lead to those results. Pride becomes too much and leads to your downfall. Proverbs 15:25, the Lord tears down the house of the proud, but maintains the widow's boundaries. Isaiah 2:11 through 12 says, the haughty looks of a man shall be brought low, and the lofty pride of men shall be humbled, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought low. The highest man will be brought to the lowest. Pride will lead to your downfall. But we're also told that pride will lead to strife. If you have pride, you will have strife. Proverbs 13:10, by insolence comes nothing but strife, but with those who take advice is wisdom. We're also told that we'll receive punishment. Proverbs 16:5, everyone who is arrogant in heart is an abomination of the Lord. Be assured he will not go unpunished. And see, that's the thing that we have to remember with pride is certainly there are people that become prideful and they may go their entire lives and maintain their wealth, maintain their riches, maintain their family, and their generations after them may maintain that wealth. But it doesn't mean that they're not eventually punished. See, the pride that we have on earth may not lead to a downfall on earth, but it will certainly lead to a downfall in eternity. And the reason for that is the last thing that we see that pride does to you, and that is it takes you away from God. Psalm 138:6, for though the Lord is high, he regards the lowly, but the haughty he knows from afar. See, those who are low, those who don't have pride, those who recognize God and his authority and his wisdom and his the accomplishment that they have through him, it said God regards them. He holds them close. He brings them into him. And that's one of the things that I love about both Psalms and Proverbs is there's so many verses there that give these drastic distinctions, right? They will say, this person is this, but this other kind of person is this. And what it tells us here is the person who lacks pride, who puts his trust in God, is brought close. But the person who is haughty, who is prideful, is pushed far away. And it said God knows him from afar, from a distance. And brothers and sisters, I cannot think of a worse place to be than far from God. There's no place that is worse to be than out of God's presence. Right. And that's where pride puts you. Because pride puts you as reliant on yourself, reliant on what you can accomplish, and God becomes nothing but an afterthought, if a thought at all. Because it's all about what you have done. And sadly, for people with pride like this, it's often like Nebuchadnezzar, that it's only after they fall, after they lose what they had fought so hard for, what they were so proud of, that they finally recognize how far from God they really are. Now, the beauty of it is, as Christians, even when we get that far, once we recognize it, He'll always welcome us back. It's like the prodigal son, right? The prodigal son who took his inheritance, went off, no doubt proud of what he had, no doubt proud of what he was able to do in that far-off land. But he suffered the fall. He was brought low. But the beauty was he had the ability to come home. And that's what we have. As Christians, even if we're prideful, even if we stray from God through that pride, He's always willing to welcome us home if we turn back and recognize Him as the true power. Amen. So, how do we avoid that sinful pride? If we don't want to get there to begin with, we don't, But even if we are, and we get there, how do we come back? How do we avoid this sinful pride? Well, the first is to always strive for humility. And that's sort of an obvious one, right? Those are the opposites. If I don't want to be prideful, I need to strive to be humble. And being humble means not proud or haughty, not arrogant or assertive, reflecting, expressing, or offered in a spirit of deference or submission, and ranking low in a hierarchy or scale. See, the world today tells us that we need to focus on how good we are, right? The world today is about your worth, your value. You should focus on how good you are and how much you can accomplish and how much you can achieve. And there's, to some extent, it is true that we should recognize our value. I mean, God places a value on us, and as Christians, we should recognize that God gives us value. So we should understand that we have value. The problem is that the world would take out the part of humility where it talks about deference or submission or being low in hierarchy. See, we always want to strive to be at the top, right? But in our relationship with God, we are never going to be at the top. I don't want to be at the top of that relationship. I always want God at the top of that relationship because in comparison to God, I am nothing. God is all powerful. God is all knowing. God can provide for me. I can't provide for myself. I can't do it without God. Amen. So if I'm not willing to be in submission to someone, and see, we don't want to be in submission to anybody either, do we? Or we don't want to have a boss, or we don't want to have to submit to authority in some ways. But if we're not willing to submit to God's authority, how can we expect that He will provide for us? How can we expect that He will care for us in the way that He promises to care for us if we're not willing to play our part in that relationship? And so we, to avoid that sinful pride, have to be humble. Proverbs 11:2 says, when pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with the humble is wisdom. And you can read through the entire book of Proverbs and see it's the book of wisdom, right? I mean, there's almost no value or no quality in Proverbs that has a higher place than wisdom because of where wisdom puts us in relationship to God. And so when we're prideful, we become a disgrace, but when we're humbled, we have wisdom. And we have wisdom because we understand God's role in our lives. The second way that we can avoid sinful pride is to simply fear the Lord. Look over at Romans chapter 11. Romans chapter 11. Starting in verse 17, but if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, do not be arrogant toward the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I might be grafted in. That is true. They were broken off because of their unbelief, but you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will He spare you. Fear and respect God. Because it is God who can bring us low. We talked about that. And the passage here says, don't be proud or haughty in the fact that you have been brought into this family and have the promise that you have, because others were denied that. Others were cut off because of their lack of belief. fear the Lord because he could just as easily cut you off because of your lack of faith, because of your unbelief, because of your pride. Don't become prideful. Fear the Lord. Third, we avoid sinful pride by loving and obeying the Father. John 14:15 says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And then in 1 John chapter 2, starting in verse 15, do not love the world or the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the desires of the flesh and the desires of the eyes and the pride of life is not from the Father, but is from the world. And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever. See, pride often flows from that love of the world, right? It flows from the love of money, the love of status, the love of power, the love of accomplishment, the love of recognition. And it says all of those pass away. None of those have true value. If you want something of true value, love and obey the Lord. Because nothing we can achieve or receive on this earth will ever compare to what God can give us in eternity. Love and obey the Lord. And then finally, we avoid pride, sinful pride, by simply showing true love to others. 1 Corinthians 13:4, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant. Romans 12:16, live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. And see, that's the other thing about pride, is when we are prideful, where does that put us in relation to others? In order to feel pride in where I am, inherently it has to mean that I think that someone else is lower. I am proud because I have more than this person. I am proud because I'm more powerful than this person or have more status than this person. But when we truly love someone, what do we want for that person? When we're prideful, we want to push them down because that brings us up. But when we truly love, all we want to do is bring them up with us. And if I bring them to my level, how can I possibly be proud because we are equals? And frankly, true Christian love doesn't bring us to equal. It pushes them higher.
Amen.
Because it's no longer about me. It's no longer about equality. It's about you because God loves you. So my focus as a Christian in love is loving others and loving God. And if I do those two things, there's no way that I can possibly have sinful pride.
Amen.
Because my focus is too much on where it should be, and that is on others and on our God. Now, if you're here tonight and you suffer from sinful pride, you maybe have become too proud in the things that you've done or the things that you have, as I said, you have an opportunity to come back. You have the ability to come back to the Father as the prodigal son and say, God, I recognize you as the true power and that I only have because of you. Or maybe you've never come into that relationship with God. And maybe that's because of your pride. Maybe your pride has kept you from submitting to God and what He wants for your life. There's no better opportunity to change that than right now. And we encourage you to do that as together we stand and sing.